to rally.
Hello there. Today I'd like to discuss player agency in World of Warcraft, specifically in World of Warcraft's narrative and the techniques with which it communicates its story and questing experience. Now that sounds like a whole lot of buzzwords, so let me filter them down into a simple statement. Player characters in World of Warcraft lack agency. We'll split this video up into 3 sections to deconstruct this statement. First, we'll cover exactly what player agency in video game narratives is. Second, we'll explore why I feel WoW's players have no agency in the world. And third, we'll discuss how this can be changed in a non-intrusive manner. Essentially, how this problem can be addressed without an absolute metric ton of work. So as it turns out, defining player agency isn't very easy. Agency generally means control and power, and video games are all about control and power, right? You control an avatar, and they only act when you prompt them to. Well, yes, that is accurate, but for this discussion, I'm focusing on narrative agency. Josh Beiser of Game Wisdom describes player agency as the player's ability to impact the story through the game design or gameplay. In essence, this means that the player is able to change aspects of a game's story through interactions with the mechanics placed in that game.
Take one more step. Go on, give me an excuse.
Players always have at least one option in a game story, and that's whether or not they want to keep playing. But let's look at some examples of games that do narrative agency very well to help describe this. In every Mass Effect game, when characters interact, the player is able to select their avatar's response. In some situations, this can lead to the player making important decisions that can affect the outcome of the stories the game tells. In Mass Effect 2 and beyond, the player can also choose to interrupt a sequence of events when prompted to, allowing them to both define their version of Commander Shepard as either a paragon or a renegade, and affect the outcome of certain scenes.
Mother, no! My daughters, you were all so much stronger.
Near the end of Mass Effect 2, the player must decide which members of their 12-person squad should lead various strike teams against the Collector base. They have to consider who should crawl through the dangerous vents to access computer terminals, who should escort liberated prisoners back to their ship, and who leads a stand against the Collector assault while the player advances to confront the final boss.
We need someone with tech skills to hack that security system. Tally, you're up.
I won't let you down.
They need to think about individual characters' strengths and weaknesses, and choosing an inappropriate team leader or sending a hardened warrior in to hack the vents instead of an engineer can lead to characters dying. There are arguments against this level of agency, but we won't cover them here. This is still about World of Warcraft.
I've got nothing more to say to you.
How about goodbye?
However, if you're after a perfect example of player agency taken to the limit, one need look no further than Larian Studios' 2017 masterpiece, Divinity Original Sin 2. This classic top-down RPG sees the player solving narrative problems in a massive variety of ways. For example, one of the earliest conundrums sees the player trapped in an open prison called Fort Joy, and tasks them with escape. There are all manner of methods to achieve this, and the game will never tell you which one is best. You can work with a prisoner to teleport one another across a chasm to the harbour. You can discover a hidden hatch that leads to the prisons and break out from there. You can reunite a guard and her tortured father and be given a key. Then use teleport or jump spells to advance up a ruined ledge, kick the ladder down, then unlock the doors and sneak out. You can rescue a traitorous guard in the prison and learn a password which will get you passage out of the underground port. You can sneak, or fight your way, through a torture chamber and escape through the sewers. You can rescue an undead knight in a cave who tells you about a hidden switch on a statue. You can win a tournament and earn the respect of a blacksmith who will remove your magic-suppressing collar, then get caught by the guards and imprisoned, then lockpick the door and make your escape. Or you can simply murder everyone that stands in your way and walk out the front door. Or, if you're like me, you can just do all of these things. That's kind of an extreme example. It's like being involved in a D&D game with the most imaginative dungeon master ever, but I think it demonstrates player agency nicely. The player is given a goal and must decide which of the solutions best suits their style, character build, and narrative desires. If you murder everyone in your way, for example, innocent people, including potential teammates, could wind up dead. All of this is done through the game's mechanics, talking to characters, convincing them to help, using spells both in and out of combat to interact with the environment, scanning the notes taken by the game's quest journal that remains helpful without holding the player's hand, and by improvising solutions on the spot. This is all supported by the mechanics of the game. Just like Mass Effect and Dragon Age's dialogue wheels are mechanics with which the player can interact with the narrative and express agency through their ability to change it. Just to be clear, World of Warcraft does not need to go to these lengths to craft compelling stories, and there are many stories told by many games that don't offer much, if any, player agency. But World of Warcraft continues to sell itself as a role-playing game, so player agency in its narrative is still something that I feel it could benefit from. Now let's talk about World of Warcraft and player agency. As I stated earlier, I think that WoW lacks any meaningful player agency in its narrative. This has got nothing to do with the combat, or the raids, or the PvP, or the crafting, or anything else like that. Those mechanics are sort of separate to the narrative, and in those regards, player agency is great. Again, this is just about the story, and the story progresses exactly as the designers intend, with players having no means to affect it beyond choosing to move it forward. Now, before I go on, I want to reiterate that this isn't a bad thing. World of Warcraft tells some great stories with this method, and I imagine for most players who have even a passing interest in the story, this isn't going to be an issue. I'll go more into this in the next section, but for now, let's just remember that I'm talking about a relatively fringe issue. So, in World of Warcraft, the story is told primarily through quests, dialogue, and cinematics. Setting aside the cinematics, which players have never really been able to affect in most games, the player has agency in WoW in only one way: whether or not they want the story to progress. Although the player character takes on a variety of roles, a recruit in their faction, an adventurer exploring the world, a commander of a large chunk of their faction's forces, the leader and greatest example of their class, they never get a say in how the story progresses. Sure, in Legion, the player can decide in which order the stories of each zone play out through their mission table, and this is a fantastic little injection of agency that I really appreciated and hope we'll see more of in Battle for Azeroth. They can also decide in which order they do side quests, although the way in which these are positioned in the world often means the player must backtrack through completed areas if they want to return to a side quest they skipped or missed. And if they did skip or miss these, nothing changes in the game world. Again, this is something that most MMOs struggle with, so this is not a unique issue to World of Warcraft, nor is it something I'm suggesting needs to just be changed. However, the problem starts to become a bit more pronounced when the player is introduced to non-player characters and works with or against them through quest chains. Every zone in Legion has a few central NPCs that the story revolves around. Azuna largely focuses on Prince Farondis' quest to redeem himself in the eyes of his people against Lady Hate Coil and the Naga. Val'Sharah's story includes Malfurion and Tyrande, with Ysera acting first as a companion, then as antagonist alongside Xavius. High Mountain introduces Mela High Mountain and Spirit Walker Ebonhorn, who work with the player to defeat the antagonist of the zone, Dargrul the Underking. Stormheim sees players working with either Sylvanas or Genn Greymane, helping them achieve their personal goals of imprisoning Eir or killing Sylvanas, while simultaneously working with Havi, otherwise known as Odin, to complete the trials of the Vrykul. Finally, Suramar includes First Arcanist Thalyssra, the first Nightborn the players meet, and their anchor for the entire story. And naturally, Grand Magistrix Elisande is the antagonist of the story. Now, it's important to note that at time of speaking, I have not completed Argus. However, from what I've read and understood about the various zones and the overall story there, you're working mostly with Velen and Illidan, Turalyon, and Illyria against the Legion. And there are no real major plot points that are decided by the player. If I'm wrong here, feel free to let me know, and I probably will experience it eventually when I get round to it. For the most part, all of these characters are enjoyable to work with and be around. But now we kind of get into subjective territory. Characters, although they generally can be likable, aren't always as such. And with so many players playing World of Warcraft and no way to please them all, some players are going to dislike NPCs they work with and actually not want them to succeed, especially if they are anti-heroes, such as Sylvanas and Illidan. For example, when I watched Gen Greymane destroy Sylvanas' magical lantern and free Ea, I cheered, and I was playing as a member of the Horde. That doesn't seem quite right. But again, this is because World of Warcraft offers no way for the player to express themselves. And here we circle to the crux of the issue. Players have no way to express agency in the story, or really express anything. Throughout Stormheim, which I feel contains a lot of examples of this lack of agency, so I'm going to focus mostly on that, and no, it's not because I've stated that I dislike Sylvanas, this is just where I found plenty of examples. The player's avatar will follow characters mindlessly, never so much as questioning some of the morally degenerate things they're asked to do. For example, at the beginning of the story, Horde players are among a fleet of ships that is ambushed by the Alliance, and they are tasked with jumping into a cannon and firing canisters of blight into the circling Griffin Riders. But there are so many race and class combinations that would never agree to do this. If I were playing a Tauren Druid, someone who lives to protect and venerate nature, my character would likely rather jump ship and flee than corrupt the land with the blight. Although this tendency to mindlessly agree to firing the blight around might work for a Forsaken character, it wouldn't for many others. A second example is Old Nifu, a random High Mountain Tauren who the player will briefly interact with as part of the Evacuate Snowmane quest. The player tells him to evacuate, and he immediately declines. The player is then given no opportunity to convince him otherwise, or to attack him, knock him out, and carry him down the mountain, or something. No matter what, Old Nifu will die when Dargrul destroys the mountainside. But don't get me wrong, this isn't the case for every quest in World of Warcraft. Just take a look at Suramar. This story is chock full of examples of player agency, or at least as much player agency as World of Warcraft can allow. From convincing Thaedrus Feathersong to not commit suicide, to feeding refugees Arkandor fruit, to grabbing Khadgar and saving him from the time stop spell, the player character is extremely important in the Suramar storyline, and I'd love to see more examples of this. Ultimately though, we return to Stormheim for the perfect example of how a lack of player agency can make you feel like a bit of an idiot. I'm speaking, of course, of the Six Trigger brothers. Also in Stormheim, the player will see these goblin characters after they have completed a quest given to them by a pair of Tauren to thin the warg numbers in the area.
Shh! Someone's coming!
Oh, hey there, chum! How can we help?
These random goblins, who have literally just appeared on an airship with a bunch of mooks and repeatedly talk about the corpses of the Tauren they have murdered as the player approaches.
Yuck, they're starting to smell. Think we should move?
Act as the quest givers for the rest of the chain, in which they rip off the player by getting them to kill hard-to-find enemies and then hand them terrible quest rewards. This is all good stuff, a self-aware jab at how player characters tend to mindlessly accept and complete quests for no reason other than because they were told to and promised a reward. When I first did this quest chain though, I was honestly looking for a way to call the goblins out on their scam, to avenge the Tauren that they had blatantly murdered, but I was never offered one. So, funny story, as I was recording the footage for this quest, I stumbled across a dialogue option to ask the Six Trigger brothers about the Tauren that they had obviously murdered. This was cool, but it doesn't lead to anything. The player character doesn't show whether or not they're convinced, and there's no option to either question them further or accept it and move on. Maybe this was just a time constraint issue. Stormheim in general does seem a little bit rushed compared to the other zones. But, as we'll talk about in just a bit, there's no real option or agency or even illusion of agency here, and what really struck me about this is how close it comes to achieving that. It's like they've taken one step in that direction and they're so close to just nailing it. Thankfully, at maximum level, the player is given another quest to go and murder the goblins that ripped them off, but again, they are given no choice as to the outcome. They can only choose to progress or ignore the story. At no point is the player's avatar offered even the slightest opportunity to resist. That last line, I feel, is the key to WoW's agency problem. The opportunity to resist. Not in big ways, not in ways that change the story and result in colossal amounts of work for the folk who design these huge, sprawling narratives, but in tiny ways that can provide a little agency for the player. And I think the answer lies in dialogue options. Now you might rightly be asking what the hell these are. So when a player interacts with a character, they sometimes have the option of speaking as their character, often asking a question. The option has a little chat bubble next to it. This will then allow them to access additional lore, maybe a clue, complete a quest, or do all other kinds of little things. This is a great system that I feel has been severely underused in general in World of Warcraft over the last few expansions, but particularly in Legion. Now don't get me wrong, there are some great examples of dialogue options making for some really cool moments. For example, early on in Suramar, you're given a quest to mingle among partygoers in a disguise, and you can talk to them and try and figure out which one of them is secretly a rebel against Grand Magistrix Elisand. And you do all of this through dialogue menus, although calling them dialogue options is a little bit dishonest because you only have one choice, despite the fact that each of them is a little bit different. It would have been cool to have all of them as options and to mix and match. The ability to interact with a character like this is really cool, at least I find it really cool. Let me apply this to the examples we talked about a little bit earlier. So on the ships in Stormheim, as the Alliance attacks and the player is told to use blight canisters, they could interact with Nathanos and protest. Something as simple as, "The blight is abhorrent, I'll never use it," could be offered, and Nathanos could respond, all through text, no dialogue required, by informing the player that if they don't obey, they'll lose their spot in the Horde. Or maybe he'll deflect the protest with an excuse like, "Now isn't the time for this, get on that catapult or we're all going to die." As many as one simple dialogue option, or more, could allow for players to express themselves in these little ways, even if that doesn't change how quests play out. I know I've stated in the past that I'm not a big fan of Sylvanas, so I want to make doubly clear that this has nothing to do with the specific non-player character that the player is interacting with, but in these larger quests, when the player has a role, it would certainly be interesting, I feel, to allow them these little opportunities to express themselves. Another example. Old Nifu, the stubborn High Mountain Tauren we spoke of earlier, could have a few simple dialogue options to try and convince him to leave, even if the player is unable to do so, no matter what they pick. What matters is that they have the opportunity to try, not try once because the quest demanded it and then walk out. The whole point of this is to extend that agency just a tiny bit, enough for it to register, rather than change everything about the story. It's about players being considered by the game's story, not their ability to change it. Another example. Later on in Stormheim, as Sylvanas puts herself and her people above the Horde, and if you disagree with this analysis, watch the most recent cinematic for 7.3.5, where every single member on the Horde table shouts for the Horde, except for Sylvanas and Nathanos. Anyway, as Sylvanas does this in Stormheim, players could have the option to speak with her and call out her actions and say, "Hey, you're the war chief. Maybe you should not be doing this." She could rebuke them or offer an explanation or something. That's the point. Something. And this doesn't have to be restricted to just resistance, to just saying, "Hey, why are you doing this?" or "We shouldn't be doing that." Asking questions and expanding the lore and the story, and most importantly, deepening that story, I feel, could be very interesting. This way, the player is not only able to demonstrate a little agency, but it also, and perhaps this is more important than the agency, offers a chance to deepen the personalities of the characters and the world. As we've discussed earlier, World of Warcraft's story revolves around these characters. Any opportunity to interact with them should surely be taken, especially one that requires comparatively little effort compared to writing and implementing dialogue, voice acting, or complex quest events. Now don't get me wrong, I have some idea of how this all comes together. I'm just a layman, but I know a little bit more than I think the average player, and I wouldn't be able to do this. I'm not a game designer, but it's complicated. So I can understand why in some situations, with all of the various triggers and waypoints and auras and everything going around in a quest to make it tick, as something as simple as making a few dialogue options in a menu could break everything. But with the Battle for Azeroth Alpha coming up, I feel like now is a good chance to talk about this. What's great is that this is already being done by some quests. Take the quest Morale Booster in Azuna. The player is tasked with obtaining some fighter chow from a Hosen. After arriving and interacting with Uka Duka, they have two paths to take. They can enter into a long, well-written and genuinely funny Hosen argument, flinging insults back and forth until Uka Duka submits and hands over her chow. Or, the player can ask nicely and immediately succeed. And at any point while arguing with her, the player can try the nice option, as it always remains available. But if they're feeling stubborn, they can keep going to the end of the argument and succeed anyway. This is a fantastic little quest and the perfect example of how player agency can make a quest memorable, whilst also deepening the world. Now we know what mank means in the Hosen language. So not only can this method be used to deepen the characters, but it can be used to deepen the world as well. As players advance through Zandalar and Kulturas, there will no doubt be countless opportunities to have them interact with characters of all shapes and sizes, and learn more about the culture, personalities, and events of the characters in the land around them. World of Warcraft's quests already do such a great job with other techniques that explain aspects of the world, but it's almost always at a skin-deep level. And again, this isn't a bad thing. WoW does what it does very well, but there are always aspects that can be improved, and I feel this is one of them. From the launch of World of Warcraft, we've explored so much territory and met so many characters that the game is extremely widespread. Now I think it might be time to add a little bit of depth, and see how that could benefit the game. Now, it's very easy to say that this doesn't matter, and for the most part, it doesn't. World of Warcraft's quest experience is already very strong, but this invariably means that there are fans who care a great deal about the characters and the setting. Clearly, so do the designers. This is just a suggestion, and I'd like to extend a challenge to you. Think of your own examples of player agency in World of Warcraft, and how dialogue options, or indeed your own solutions, could change how player avatars express their identity in the game world. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the World of Warcraft.